Imagine, for a moment, a stretch of land where reality feels thinner, where silence carries more weight than sound, and where the ground itself seems to hold its breath. Tucked away in northeastern Utah, in the wide emptiness of the Uintah Basin, lies a property that has terrified, fascinated, and obsessed people for decades. To its owners, neighbors, investigators, and skeptics, it is known simply as Skinwalker Ranch. But to those who dare to listen closely, to those who sift through whispers of the past, it is something far more unsettling, a living archive of the unexplained. From the first moment you step onto this ranch, something feels wrong. The fences creak even when the wind is still. The night sky glows with lights that aren't stars. Shadows dart just outside your vision, too large to be coyotes, too quick to be human. And somewhere out there, in the scrubland and red rock, you feel the weight of eyes watching you, waiting. But before we dive into the strange events that made Skinwalker Ranch a household name, we must step back in time, long before modern ranchers, long before government investigations, long before UFO documentaries, into the deep well of Native American legend. Because if we don't understand the land's spiritual history, we cannot begin to understand the curse that seems to linger over it. The word Skinwalker doesn't come from TV shows or modern folklore. It comes from some of the oldest and most guarded traditions of the Navajo people. In Navajo culture, there are healers and medicine men who use their knowledge for good, curing illness, guiding the community, preserving balance. But there is also the opposite, those who twist their power into something darker. These dark practitioners are called Yi-Nal Lushi. Literally, with it, he goes on all fours. In English, we call them skinwalkers. According to legend, a skinwalker is a witch who has broken sacred taboos in pursuit of power. To transform into a beast, they wear the skin of the animal they wish to become. Wolf, coyote, owl, or bear. They are not shapeshifters in the fairy tale sense, but predators. Predators who mimic voices, prowl the night, and bring death wherever they roam. In Navajo communities, even speaking their name aloud is dangerous, for it is believed to draw their attention. But how did this legend become tied to a ranch in Utah? Here lies the beginning of a story that mixes folklore with the real human conflict. For centuries, the Navajo and the Ute tribes had strained relations. The Ute people, who lived in the Uintah Basin, had allied with European settlers and even profited from the slave trade, capturing Navajo and selling them. The Navajo, in turn, were said to have cursed the land of the Ute, calling upon skinwalkers to haunt and torment them. Whether you believe in curses or not, the story of Skinwalker Ranch begins here, with blood, betrayal, and the idea that the land itself was marked, poisoned by rage and revenge. Fast forward to the 20th century, ranchers, farmers, and oil prospectors came and went in the Uintah Basin. Yet, among the locals, one patch of land always had a darker reputation than the rest. They spoke of giant wolves that could not be killed, of glowing orbs that danced over fields, of cattle disappearing without a trace. By the 1970s and 80s, whispers of UFO sightings in the region multiplied. Pilots reported strange craft darting across the sky. Hunters told of animals behaving unnaturally, and ranchers spoke of mutilated cattle, drained of blood with surgical precision. It wasn't just stories around the fire. Deputies, journalists, and scientists began taking note, and soon, the land that would become Skinwalker Ranch was no longer just a local legend. It was a national mystery. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman bought the ranch. To them, it was an opportunity. A spread of nearly 500 acres where they could raise prized cattle. The property had a decent house, pastures, and a location near family. But there were red flags, even before they signed the deed. Neighbors warned them the land was cursed. The previous owners, they were told, had endured unexplainable events. There were stories of large predators stalking the property, of lights in the sky, of strange sounds echoing through the canyons. The Shermans, practical ranchers, brushed it off. People like to spin tall tales, especially in isolated communities. They had work to do. But almost immediately after moving in, the Shermans began to see things they couldn't explain. And their story, their terror, their experiences would eventually drag in scientists, billionaires, and even the U.S. government. On their very first days at the ranch, the Shermans witnessed something that would etch itself into their memory forever. A massive wolf, far larger than any wolf Terry had seen, walked calmly up to their corral where a calf was penned. At first, the family wasn't frightened. The animal seemed oddly tame. Terry even reached out and stroked its fur, amazed by its size and calmness. But within seconds, the wolf lunged, clamping its jaws around the calf's nose and trying to drag it through the bars. Terry grabbed his rifle. At point-blank range, he fired a shot into the wolf's side. The wolf didn't flinch. He fired again. Nothing. Finally, after a third, fourth, and fifth shot, chunks of flesh tore away. But the wolf showed no signs of pain. With Gwen and the kids screaming, Terry reloaded and switched to a larger caliber weapon. Another shot, finally, made the beast back away. It stared at them calmly, then trotted off into the distance. Terry and his son gave chase, following its tracks in the mud. But then, just a few hundred feet from the corral, the paw prints stopped. Not faded, not lost. They simply stopped, as if the wolf had vanished into thin air. This was their welcome to Skinwalker Ranch. Over the following weeks and months, the Shermans' lives descended into a waking nightmare. They saw floating orbs of light that seemed to watch them, darting away whenever approached. They found their cattle mutilated, organs removed with surgical precision, not a drop of blood spilled on the ground. Doors inside their home would slam shut. Heavy machinery would move on its own. Invisible forces would bellow like beasts in the night. Most terrifying of all were the creatures. Not just the giant wolf, but hulking beasts with yellow eyes. Strange humanoid figures that vanished when pursued. And voices that seemed to call their names from the darkness. Terry Sherman, once a no-nonsense rancher, became obsessed. He carried rifles at all times. He patrolled his property day and night. He stopped inviting neighbors over, and eventually, in desperation, he reached out to scientists and reporters. Because whatever was happening at Skinwalker Ranch was beyond cattle theft, beyond bad luck. It was something else, something bigger. When a journalist named George Knapp reported on the Sherman family's experiences in the mid-1990s, Skinwalker Ranch exploded into the national consciousness. Suddenly, people across America were reading about Utah's cursed land. And in the shadows, powerful people were watching. Among them, a billionaire fascinated by the paranormal government contractors and researchers who saw the ranch as the ultimate laboratory for the unexplained. Soon, Skinwalker Ranch would no longer be just the Sherman's nightmare. It would become an American obsession and a battleground between belief and skepticism, science and legend. The wolf incident was only the beginning. For most families, such an encounter would be the strangest story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. For the Shermans, it was only the first chapter in an endless barrage of the impossible. Terry Sherman tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wolf was just sick, its nervous system dull. Maybe adrenaline masked its pain. Maybe the tracks that disappeared into nothing were just a trick of the dirt and lighting. But in his gut, he knew what he saw and knew something wasn't right. Over the next 2 years, the Shermans were pushed to the edge of sanity. It started with strange lights. Every few nights, Terry or Gwen would spot glowing orbs drifting across the pastures. Sometimes they were bright blue, about the size of a baseball, weaving between the trees as though under intelligent control. Other times, fiery orange orbs the size of basketballs would hover above the fields, pulsing like living things. The Shermans quickly learned these lights were not harmless. On one occasion, a blue orb floated close to their dogs. The animals barked furiously, chasing after it into the brush. Terry heard their barks grow frantic, then strangled. When he reached the spot minutes later, all he found were 3 piles of charred flesh, his beloved dogs reduced to unrecognizable remains. The message was clear. The lights were dangerous, and they could kill. Ranching is hard work, and the Shermans invested heavily in heavy machinery to manage their land. But more than once, they woke to find their equipment moved in ways no human could have managed. One morning, Terry discovered a 2,000-pound feed trough had been lifted out of its concrete moorings and dragged across the field. There were no tire marks, no footprints, nothing to suggest human involvement. On another day, massive fence posts were ripped out of the ground and laid neatly in a pile, as though some unseen force wanted to make a point. The activity wasn't random. It was targeted, intelligent. Whatever was behind it wasn't just present. It was toying with them. Perhaps the most unnerving experiences were the sounds. At night, while walking his property, Terry would hear guttural growls echoing from the darkness. They weren't the cries of coyotes or the howls of wolves. They were deeper, more resonant, almost humanoid. One night, while checking his cattle, Terry heard something breathing heavily just behind him. He spun around, rifle raised, but nothing was there. The sound circled him, first to the left, then the right, as though an invisible beast stalked him through the darkness. Terrified, he fired shots into the air. The growling stopped, but only for that night. For ranchers, cattle are more than animals. They are their livelihood. So when Terry began finding his cows dead, it wasn't just tragic, it was financially devastating. But these weren't ordinary deaths. The first was found with its rectum and reproductive organs removed, carved away with surgical precision. There was no blood on the ground, no signs of struggle. Another was discovered with its ear sliced off. Yet the wound showed no signs of bleeding, as if it had been cauterized instantly. The most disturbing case came when Terry found a prized cow lying dead in the pasture. Its body was split open, ribs splayed wide, internal organs missing. Yet there were no predators, no scavengers, no tracks. It was as though something had lifted the animal, dissected it in midair, and dropped it back to earth. Each mutilation followed a pattern. Precision cuts, no blood, no footprints. It was as if some higher intelligence was experimenting with his herd. While Terry patrolled the ranch at night, Gwen often experienced terror inside the home. Doors would slam without wind, objects disappeared only to reappear in impossible places. She'd place groceries on the counter, turn her back for seconds, and find them unpacked and stacked back in their bags. At times, she swore she heard voices whispering her name. Once, while showering, she felt a presence watching her. Another time, she glimpsed a dark figure standing outside her window. When she called Terry, the figure was gone. The Shermans' children, too, were not spared. They reported seeing shadowy figures in their rooms, hearing footsteps in the hall, and feeling icy hands brush their skin as they tried to sleep. wasn't just the house. Even the land seemed alive with malice. One evening, Terry and Gwen watched in horror as their cattle panicked, running in circles as though chased by predators. But when they scanned the field, there was nothing visible. No wolves, no coyotes, no humans. Then, right before their eyes, a 400-pound cow was lifted off the ground, hoisted several feet into the air by an unseen force. The animal thrashed violently before being dropped to the ground, dead. Terry swore he saw the air shimmer around the beast like a heat wave. Gwen later said it looked like the edges of an invisible doorway. Not all encounters were with lights or invisible forces. Sometimes, the family came face to face with things that defied biology. One night, Terry spotted a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching him from a tree. When he approached, he saw an enormous creature perched among the branches, easily 7 feet tall. With claws gripping the bark, he fired at it. The bullet struck with audible thuds, but the creature did not fall. It leapt down and vanished into the shadows. Another night, the family saw a massive humanoid figure, hairless and pale, sprint across a pasture at inhuman speed. It crossed hundreds of yards in seconds before disappearing into a ridge. These weren't animals, they weren't people, and they weren't illusions. By 1996, the Shermans were unraveling. They barely slept. They carried rifles constantly. Their cattle herd, once thriving, had been decimated, financially and emotionally. They were at the breaking point. Neighbors avoided visiting. Word spread that the ranch was cursed, and soon, reporters and paranormal enthusiasts began showing up, hungry for stories. For the Shermans, the ranch was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. Finally, they made a choice. They would sell the property. They couldn't live like this any longer. But who would buy such a place? The answer came in the form of Robert Bigelow, a wealthy Las Vegas real estate magnate with an obsession for the paranormal. Bigelow was no stranger to strange phenomena. He had already founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS, a team of scientists and former military personnel dedicated to investigating UFOs, hauntings, and unexplained events. When Bigelow heard about the Shermans' plight, he didn't hesitate. In 1996, he purchased the ranch outright. For the Shermans, it was a relief. For Bigelow, it was the beginning of an unprecedented scientific experiment. From that moment, Skinwalker Ranch was no longer just a personal nightmare. It was about to become the most studied paranormal hotspot in America. There are places in this world where silence holds secrets far older than memory. Places where the trees themselves seem to lean in, listening, as if they too are waiting for answers that never came. Tonight, I want to take you to one such place. Not many people outside of rural Pennsylvania have heard of Cold Creek. On the map, it's nothing, just a forgotten stretch of land, thick with pine, cut by a river that runs fast in the spring, but dries to a trickle by late summer. Yet, in the archives, buried in old police records, faded newspaper clippings, and the whispered recollections of the few remaining locals, Cold Creek holds a story that is equal parts haunting and unexplainable. It begins, as many such stories do, with a disappearance. In the autumn of 1972, a young boy named Daniel Whitaker went missing while walking home from school. He was 11 years old. His route was short, barely half a mile along a dirt road that wound through sparse woods. He never arrived home. At first, no one panicked. His mother assumed he'd stopped by a friend's house. His father thought maybe Daniel had gone fishing at the creek, something he often did in the late afternoon. But as dusk settled over the valley, concern hardened into fear. Neighbors joined in the search, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the dark. The police arrived shortly after. They combed the woods, dragged the creek, and even brought in bloodhounds. The dogs picked up Daniel's scent at the roadside, and then, abruptly, it vanished. Not faded, not meandering, just gone, as if he had stepped off the earth. Days turned into weeks. Flyers went up in neighboring towns. The story made the local paper, then faded. By winter, the Whitakers had moved away, unable to bear the sight of their son's empty room. The official report filed by the state police listed Daniel as a probable runaway, but the locals knew better. No 11-year-old boy runs away with nothing. Not a backpack, not a jacket, not even the fishing rod he loved so much. Daniel Whitaker had not run away. He had been taken, or worse, he had been erased. Cold Creek tried to move on. It tried to be just another quiet town where life moved slowly, measured by the rhythm of seasons and church bells. But the peace didn't last. In 1979, 7 years later, a young couple disappeared on their way back from a barn dance. Their names were Michael and Sarah Turner. He was 20, she was 19. Witnesses last saw them leaving in Michael's truck, laughing, headlights vanishing down the narrow road that led past the creek. The next morning, the truck was found abandoned by the roadside. The driver's door was open, keys still in the ignition. Michael's wallet sat untouched on the dashboard. Sarah's purse was on the passenger seat, but there was no trace of them. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. It was Daniel Whitaker's disappearance all over again. The state police returned, this time with more equipment, more men. They canvassed every inch of those woods, and again, the dogs followed the scent until it ended abruptly near the creek, as though, once more, the earth itself had swallowed its prey. And here is where the story takes its first strange turn, because during that second search, officers reported something unusual. In the damp soil near the riverbank, they found footprints that didn't belong. Not boots, not sneakers, bare feet, large, almost inhumanly so, with a stride longer than any ordinary man's. The tracks began at the water's edge and disappeared into the forest, where they simply stopped. The prints were photographed, cast in plaster, and filed away. No explanation was ever offered. By the early 1980s, Cold Creek had developed a reputation. Truckers passing through would joke about the place. Don't break down near Cold Creek, or you'll vanish too. But for the locals, it was no laughing matter. Farmers began locking their doors at night. Hunters swore they saw strange lights flickering through the trees. One man, old Mr. Hanley, claimed that while fishing by the creek at dusk, he saw a figure on the opposite bank. Tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It stood watching him silently, and when he blinked, it was gone. The police never entertained such stories, of course. They chalked it up to folklore, paranoia, or the overactive imagination of a frightened community. But if you talk to those who lived there, even now, decades later, you'll notice the same thing. The way their eyes shift when Cold Creek comes up in conversation, the way their voices drop, as though the trees themselves might be listening. For most of America, Cold Creek is a blank spot on the map, but when I started digging into the archives, old records tucked away in courthouse basements, microfilm reels in forgotten libraries, I began to see a pattern. Daniel Whitaker in 72, Michael and Sarah Turner in 79, and then another case buried deeper, barely mentioned in the press. In 1986, a young teacher named Claire Hollis vanished. She had recently moved to the area from Pittsburgh, drawn by the promise of quiet life in the country. On the morning of November 14th, she parked her car at the school and was seen unlocking her classroom. She never showed up for her first period class. By noon, The janitor found her car still in the lot, her purse and keys inside. Claire was gone. No one saw her leave. No one heard anything unusual. She had simply stepped out of time. Once again, the bloodhounds were brought in. Once again, they followed her scent to the edge of the creek, and once again, it ended there. The case files note something peculiar, though. Teachers at the school reported that in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Claire had complained of being watched. She told a colleague she kept waking in the middle of the night, certain she heard someone breathing outside her window. She had begun writing letters to her sister, describing shadows that lingered too long in the corners of her house. Those letters were never mailed. Police found them in her desk drawer after she vanished. The story of Cold Creek might have ended with the disappearance of Claire Hollis in 1986. 3 vanishings in 14 years are enough to stain any place with infamy. But Cold Creek wasn't finished. No, it was only just beginning to reveal how deep its darkness ran. It was the summer of 1992 when the next disappearance shook the town. This time it wasn't a child, or a couple, or a young teacher. It was a man the locals knew well, Sheriff Thomas Granger. Granger had been sheriff of Cold Creek's county for nearly 2 decades. He was there when Daniel went missing. He was there for the Turners. He'd led the search for Claire Hollis. Through it all, he had remained calm, professional, skeptical. He didn't indulge in stories about tall figures by the creek or strange lights in the woods. He dismissed the plaster casts of giant footprints as distorted animal tracks. To him, there was always an explanation, even if it was one he couldn't yet prove. But in July of 1992, Sheriff Granger vanished too. He had gone out fishing one evening, a habit he was known for. His patrol car was later found parked by the roadside near the creek. The fishing pole was leaning against the guardrail. A thermos of coffee sat half-drunk on the hood, but Granger was gone. The next morning, deputies scoured the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, and unlike the other cases, this time there were no bloodhounds. The unit had been disbanded years earlier. For the first time, Cold Creek felt leaderless. If the sheriff himself could be taken, then no one was safe. The newspaper headline said it all. The sheriff joins the missing. Granger's disappearance broke something in the town. Families that had lived in Cold Creek for generations began to move away. The school closed in 1995 due to lack of enrollment. Businesses shuttered. Houses were boarded up. By the year 2000, Cold Creek had become a ghost town in all but name. A handful of stubborn families remained, clinging to their farms and their routines. But the vibrancy was gone. And yet, the vanishings did not stop. In 2003, hikers passing through the area reported something bizarre. They had camped near the creek and, around midnight, were awakened by voices. Not human voices, at least. Not in any language they recognized. Low, guttural sounds carried on the wind, like chanting. When one of the hikers shined a flashlight toward the tree line, he claimed he saw eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the beam. Eyes at different heights, some far too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. The hikers fled, abandoning their gear. They filed a report with the state police, but nothing came of it. That same summer, another disappearance occurred. A drifter known only as Eddie, who often passed through rural towns doing odd jobs, was last seen in Cold Creek. He had been working for one of the remaining farmers, fixing a roof. One evening he left to sleep by the creek as he often did. He was never seen again. The farmer later told police he found Eddie's backpack near the riverbank. Inside were clothes, a pocket knife, and a small notebook. The last entry in the notebook read simply, "They watch from the trees." Here's where the story begins to intersect with something I have seen before. in other archives, in other forgotten corners of North America. Because in 2007, a box was found in the basement of the abandoned Cold Creek Courthouse. It was unmarked, sealed with brittle tape. Inside were documents, photographs, and cassette recordings, all related to the disappearances. It seemed someone within law enforcement had been quietly collecting information over the decades, building a secret file outside of the official record. Among the contents was a memo written in 1987 after Claire Hollis disappeared. It was signed only with the initials TG, almost certainly Sheriff Thomas Granger. The memo read, "The official reports don't reflect the truth. Something unnatural is at work here. We are not dealing with a man or even a group of men. The prints don't match. The dogs know more than we do. I have seen it myself, just beyond the tree line at dusk. If I vanish, understand this. It is real. The creek takes who it wants." This was the sheriff, the skeptic, admitting in private that something beyond reason stalked his town. But the most chilling piece in that box wasn't the memo. It was one of the cassette tapes, labeled only 11-2086. The tape begins with the hiss of old magnetic recording, then a woman's voice, shaking, breathless. It was Claire Hollis. She speaks in fragments as though recording in secret, terrified of being overheard. "I can't sleep anymore. They're outside again. I hear them moving in the leaves. Sometimes I think I see them at the window. Faces, but not faces. Too long, too thin. I told the police, but they don't believe me. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. They're real. They're real." The tape cuts off abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the recorder had been switched off. Claire vanished the next morning. The discovery of that tape should have reignited investigation, but by 2007, Cold Creek was nearly abandoned. The courthouse was sealed. The box was shelved. No one in authority wanted to revisit the nightmare. And so the file was forgotten again, like so many others. But here is where the story broadens, because as I sifted through archives beyond Cold Creek, old folklore, tribal histories, colonial accounts, I began to see echoes. In 1889, a report from northern Canada described settlers vanishing from their cabins, leaving meals half-eaten on the table. Witnesses spoke of figures in the woods, impossibly tall with glowing eyes. In 1912, in the Appalachian Mountains, 3 miners were said to have disappeared while walking home at dusk. Their lanterns were found by the roadside, still burning. Locals spoke of the Watchers, shadowy beings that took men who strayed too close to the river. Different places, different times, the same elements, sudden vanishings, strange footprints, lights in the trees, the sense of being watched. Cold Creek was not an isolated mystery. It was part of something larger, something older. When you begin to trace patterns in history, you must ask yourself a dangerous question. Are these events connected by coincidence or by design? Cold Creek's disappearances echo across centuries, scattered across North America, like broken fragments of the same mirror. But the closer you look, the more the pieces begin to align. Long before settlers laid claim to the forests of Pennsylvania, the Lenape people lived in the region. Among their oral traditions exists a story, rarely told, often whispered only among elders, of beings they called the Onakano. The word translates loosely to those who wait in silence. The Onakano were said to dwell near rivers and creeks, appearing only when the land was quiet and the moon was hidden. They were described as tall, with elongated limbs, faces obscured by shadow. The elders warned children never to wander alone by the water after dark. Those who did, they said, would not return. When colonial missionaries first documented these tales in the 1700s, they dismissed them as superstition. Yet, centuries later, the descriptions mirror the accounts from Cold Creek almost exactly. So were the Lenape preserving memory of the same beings that Sheriff Granger glimpsed, the same beings Claire Hollis feared at her window. One of the strangest threads I uncovered lies far from Pennsylvania, in the frozen wilderness of northern Ontario. In 1903, a hunting party stumbled upon a cabin deep in the woods, smoke rising from its chimney. Curious, they approached, hoping to find shelter from the snowstorm closing in. What they found was unsettling. The door hung open, a stew pot simmered on the stove. 3 plates sat on the table, half filled with food, but the chairs were empty. The wanderers searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, but found no sign of the occupants. The strangest detail: footprints led away from the cabin into the snow. 3 sets at first, then just 20 paces out, 2, another 20 paces, 1, and then nothing. No collapse, no drag marks, no indication of where the final set had gone. The prints simply ended. Locals whispered that the Onakano, or something like them, had claimed the family. The story never reached the broader world, tucked away in a small-town gazette, forgotten to time. But when I placed that report alongside the Cold Creek cases, the parallels were undeniable. Cold Creek itself wasn't finished making itself known. In 2011, 2 urban explorers ventured into the ghost town, cameras in hand, chasing the thrill of decay. They posted their footage online, though only fragments survive today. In the video, they move through the crumbling school, graffiti on the walls, desks overturned. They joke nervously, whispering about the cursed creek. Then the camera jolts. From a broken window, a light can be seen in the forest. At first, it looks like a lantern swinging in the dark, but as the cameraman zooms in, the light rises higher, too high for a man to be holding it. It weaves slowly through the treetops, pulsing faintly, before vanishing altogether. The explorers flee, their laughter now replaced with genuine fear. One of them posted later that night, "We saw something in the woods. It wasn't a person. I'll never go back." Within a week, their account was deleted. As I sifted deeper into the hidden files, I found one final piece of the puzzle that chilled me more than any other. It was a newspaper clipping from 1954, nearly 2 decades before Daniel Whitaker disappeared. The article described the death of a man named Harold Finch, a surveyor working on a proposed railway line near Cold Creek. He had been found drowned in the shallow water, face contorted as though frozen in terror. The coroner's report noted no signs of foul play, but mentioned an oddity. Finch's hands were covered in scratches, as though he had been clawing at something, perhaps trying to hold on to the earth itself as he was dragged under. The death was ruled an accident, but Finch's journal, found in his tent, told a different story. His final entry read, "Voices last night, outside the camp, too many to count. They do not speak like us. If I do not return, know this, Cold Creek is not empty." That was 1954, nearly 20 years before Daniel Whitaker vanished. The timeline stretched farther back than anyone realized. So what are we to make of this? 4 documented disappearances in Cold Creek. A sheriff who confessed to seeing something inhuman. A teacher who recorded her own fear of faces at the window. A box of evidence deliberately hidden from public record. And beyond that, scattered reports across the continent. Families gone without a trace. Miners, settlers, travelers, all taken near rivers or creeks, their footprints ending as though they'd stepped into another world. Even if half of these accounts are folklore or exaggeration, What of the other half? What of the plaster casts that showed footprints too large for any man? What of the tape that captured Claire's final words? How many stories must align before coincidence collapses under the weight of its own impossibility? I have spent years following these threads. I have spoken to the last remaining residents of Cold Creek, men and women who refuse to leave, though they know what lurks just beyond their property lines. They tell me the same thing in hushed voices. It doesn't come every year. Sometimes a decade passes. But when it comes, you'll know. The woods go quiet. The dogs hide. The air feels heavy, like the storm before lightning. And then, someone is gone. They do not claim to understand it. They do not try to name it. But they live with it. And they warn me, warn all of us, not to linger near the creek after dark. Because the Onakano, or whatever we choose to call them, are still there, watching, waiting,